Hello, everyone. So we're going to talk about Altab Ali Park in Whitechapel, and I'm just going to start by very briefly introducing the work that I've done with the Survey of London, which was a very old organisation, started in the 1860s by C.R. Ashby. And it started to try and document the disappearing kind of heritage buildings of London. Still going, it's based in the Bartlett School of Architecture now. And it had been carrying out a study of Whitechapel over the last, from 2016 to 2020, and there's a publication being produced at the moment. There's also a website, and I'll just share my screen here so you can see here. Now, it's this site here. Let me just do that. And on the website, the idea is that there will be, people have put their own stories of Whitechapel, as well as researched history by the historians, as well as oral histories that we carried out. And a number of different types of stories have been gathered about Whitechapel and placed onto the site. So Whitechapel is this area that you see here, the orange buildings. And the City of London's here, Altab Ali Park is here. So if we go into the Altab Ali Park site, then what you get is this opportunity to read more about each building or each site in Whitechapel. So if we go to the Altab Ali page, what we have is information which is partly contributed, and this part here is contributed by Ansar Ullah, who is a member of the Swadhinata Trust, which is a cultural and heritage organisation in the East End. And Julie Begum is here as well from the Swadhinata Trust, and we're hoping to hear from her a little bit later on. And so there's contributions from Ansar Ali on the history of Bangladeshi migration in Whitechapel. And I encourage you to go onto the site, it's surveyoflondon.org, and have a read of this as sort of background to the talk that you're going to, the presentation we're going to watch today. And that talks about the significance of Altab Ali Park for the community. And then there's writing here by the surveyors, historians from the Survey of London, which is a little bit more, if you like, archivally based. And just show you a few photographs. So this will start to give you an idea of the park and where it sits and what's happened there. And I'll just start with this aerial photo, because that gives you an idea. It's the site of the Church of St. Mary Matfelon, which was built in the 13th century out of white chalk rubble, and it's the church that gave Whitechapel its name. And that church was rebuilt subsequently over the centuries, right up to the 1860s, when the last rebuilding occurred, and then it was bombed in the war and not rebuilt. And I think Katherine will talk to us about the footprint of the church, which you can see here, which they've worked with. It was a burial ground, so again, I'll let Katherine talk about that, and then different other sites. There's something called the Shahed Minar here, and sort of landscaping here. So I'll leave all of that for Katherine to explain, but just to give you a sort of a view of the site, as it were, from above, and to give you very quickly a few historical photographs. This was the church in 1941, just after it had been bombed. So these are illustrations by an artist, Judith Ferenc, who we commissioned for the survey to produce various illustrations of Whitechapel. Again, church in 1888. The church, after it had been bombed, so quite a substantial sort of Victorian Gothic structure. And these are all on the survey website. These are photographs of the park. This was a sort of image of an earlier incarnation of the church. So I'll just very quickly flick through a few of those. And one of the important things that happens in the park is that it's a site for many political events relating to Bangladeshi history. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and hopefully Julie will also talk a little bit about that. And yeah, but you can go to, and this is a photograph here of Altab Ali, who was murdered in 1978 in a racist attack, and the park was named after him. I think it was 1999 or 98 now, I can't remember, but I'll be corrected down the line, I'm sure. Yeah, and then what I'll do is let me hand over to Katherine, because we've got a lot to go through, and that's just to give a very quick and brief setting of the scene for the work that MUF then did, which was implemented, I think, in 2011, but Katherine will give us the sort of full background and story to the project. So I'll hand over to you, Katherine, and I will stop my share, and I think you can then put your screen up. Yeah.
Okay, is that, have we got it?
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. It's so lovely to see those historic images of the relationship between the park when it was a functioning religious space and the street. And I think that was one of the things that was very important in the way that the design evolved for us. And we can talk a bit about the brief, because I can see Tim Rettler's in the audience, I think, after we made the presentation, so I can just sort of give the kind of evolution of the scheme. But the commission came out of High Street 2012 in relation to the Olympics, and this route from Aldgate to Stratford was seen as a kind of seminal Olympic boulevard, if you like, which didn't actually materialise kind of when the Olympics were actually running for many reasons. And initially the brief to us was to look at the space of the street from Aldgate down past Altab Ali, and we made this kind of strategic decision to focus the funding into the park itself, mainly because this is an area which has very little green space and very high density, and that sense of kind of how you can deliver maximum benefit for people who actually live in a place kind of after, you know, those grand events like the Olympics seemed a really important thing to do. So this map locates where Altab Ali is in Whitechapel, with the Whitechapel Art Gallery here, and the Bell Foundry is just further down the road, and then the mosque is slightly further down, another block down. At the kind of right at the early pitch stage, our kind of initial sort of intuitive concept was this idea of how could one reveal all of those kind of invisible histories of Whitechapel that shaped it as a cultural place and shaped the fabric of it. And we kind of made this rather sort of crude matrix that sort of identified those sort of themes, if you like, which was philanthropy, activism, revolution and devotion. And sort of the sense of that park holds all of those in some way, and how could the scheme bring those to the surface and make an inclusive public space. And that sense of it being a space that could accommodate all those differences seemed really important, and kind of seems even more important now given the change to the kind of planning rules and the kind of sense that, you know, the potential for slums of the future to be built public space as a space where kind of people can have that outside space, can have that kind of living room outside their own domestic spaces seems even more important. And so the research that we undertook took many forms to kind of test that intuitive first kind of move. One of which was a sort of analysis of looking at the history of the park, and looking even at that point how there were these sort of overlays of cultural relationships going on. So this is a kind of late, kind of late 19th century view of the church, which was a kind of high sort of Anglican church with a Hebrew banner on the side of it, which sort of demonstrated that the congregation of the church went beyond just a kind of religious a kind of gathering, and it had a very, very strong sort of community kind of program to it. And then the image on the right is the Language Day procession, which happens on the 12th of February across the world, where there are replica Shahed Saleem, and it's a celebration of the language martyrs, which in turn led to the foundation of the state of Bangladesh. And so you've got two very different kind of coming together of the religious and the secular, a kind of a sense of identity through place, and then a sense of identity through religion. And so that those became the sort of themes that we kind of wanted to play out in the park, that sense of finding those traces of the religious, making a setting for the secular, and then within that making space for play, and then telling the story. So the narrative of place was embedded in the design. And I suppose the kind of the formal move that we made was to make, this is the existing entrance to the park, and it has a diagonal route that runs up here to the Roman Catholic Church, which is on this corner here. So we made an additional entrance here so that when you're walking along this very, very busy, heavily trafficked road, you can cut into the park and then walk along this path and cut out again. So that sense that you can kind of both be on your way but be in the park at the same time was really, really important as a kind of formal move. And so these are a series of photographs that came from our initial observational analysis on the top, and then how that played out into the design on the images below. And one of the striking things about the park was that it's a social space for many different groups of people, but one of the groups of people that was very, very evident are young men that come from Bangladesh and come from an area of Sylhet mainly, and go to business schools in the area, and they work in kind of extended family businesses, and they probably live in overcrowded accommodation. And during the lunchtime or at the end of their lessons, you get groupings of kind of 30 to 40 of these young men in the park, which used it as their living room effectively, but there were very few places for them to sit, and so they would sort of congregate in a way that you could see many other park users sort of intimidated, just because, you know, presence of a large group of young men, you know, people do find intimidating. And so that sense of how we could design a space in the park that could be both a route and a destination, and make a very dispersed sort of social setting where many different people could come together, was a kind of one of the drivers. And then on the right hand side, this is the same image looking along the route parallel to the road, showing how we made this this path, this additional path. So rather than walking along the roadside, you could come into the park and walk on the other side of the trees and have a much more kind of bucolic experience of your journey for a moment. And again, the images on the top are from our initial sort of observational analysis. This is looking towards the Shahed Saleem monument, which is the monument to the language martyrs who protected the language of Bengal, which eventually, as I described, was part of the movement that was kind of led to the founding of Bangladesh. And there's a replica, this is a replica of the original one in Dhaka. It's an exact replica, but we felt that somehow the setting for it was sort of not adequate to its importance. And although the sort of sculptural elements, the steel and are kind of high quality, it was sitting on this rather bizarre plinth that was sort of made of almost like a rubber crumb material. And so in the scheme, we gave it a kind of hard stone terrazzo plinth, and then made a sort of a landscape setting for it. So shaped the land so that it sort of appears out of a valley between two hills, landscape with rocks and with a pink terrazzo path leading up to it. And then on this side here, this is some of the fragments of the footprint of the original medieval church, the Whitechapel, which again makes these sort of dispersed places for people to sit, or for kind of informal play to happen. And so this is on the left is the plan of the evolution of how we created the formal path. And Cristina Montero was part of the design team, and she was really instrumental in kind of working through this geometry with me. And we made many, many overlays of these, the many different churches that had stood on the site. And eventually this kind of resulted in sort of tracing the edge of the last church to sit on the site, to make this extended pathway that makes kind of both this route, but also kind of many different places for people to sit and congregate. And then this, which is made of green green terrazzo, so it almost looks like the kind of ground has pushed up through the grass, and it's got polished terrazzo along the edge, and then a kind of rough terrazzo where you walk. So when you're sitting on the edge with your knees over the edge of your leg is against something smooth rather than something hard. And then the green terrazzo is sort of intersected with these carved stone blocks that trace the footprint of the Whitechapel. And so here is in more detail showing, this is the green terrazzo tracing of the church, and there's the image of the terrazzo, and then intercut with these Portland stone pieces. And the kind of the design of the pieces was worked through hand drawing, with Christina and I hand drawing together, and kind of thinking about how we could make spaces that sort of somehow kind of suggested the ecclesiastical architecture without it completely dominating, but also within that could make kind of totally playable spaces where they were very, very open to interpretation and open to how you might use them. And to realise these pieces, we made a relationship with the Building Crafts College, which is about 2 miles further down the road going towards Stratford. And the Building Crafts College was started by John Cass, who was actually buried in the churchyard, which is now Altab Ali Park. And we made a relationship with the stonemason, the head stonemason, and with the students kind of produced these, you know, very, very sketchy drawings that they then took up and kind of made one-to-one drawings. And then we bought stone up from Portland, and then they carved the stone. And so this was designed almost like a marble run with grooves in it. And this came from observation of how children kind of use the as found world to play in. So these are images of children on a beach where this is a rock that's been quarried with the drill holes going through it. And they spent about 2 hours just playing with the grooves in the stone to make it a playable thing by pouring water on it. And then this piece here is carved with a carom board, which is a game that's played across India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, with it's sort of like a cross between sort of pool and sort of like pool on the chessboard, if you like, where you knock counters into the corner. So this was the polished top of the stone, polished granite that you could play that game on in the park. And so these are the pieces in situ from the drawings. So the kind of the very sort of quick hand sketches were then sort of rendered in stone by the students, who were given quite a lot of leeway to sort of interpret them. And then they were set into this tiling to suggest the kind of floor of that church that had once stood on the site. And this is an image, I think, from around the opening of the park, showing how those kind of pieces of stone sort of act to make these sort of informal places for people to sit. So the park can accommodate lots of different groupings of lots of different kinds of people. So I think this is, yeah, a combination of men in suits and kind of labourers from around the area coming to have their lunch. And this is a photograph. And so in this photograph here, you can see the landscaping in the background, which was a combination of silver birch trees and fir trees. And we worked with Joe Gibbons from J&L Gibbons to make this sort of green backdrop to the park. And then in this image here, which was taken about a week ago, shows how the trees have grown up and make that, that green sort of curtain around the park. And this is the spire of the St. Joseph Boniface, the Catholic church in that corner, which is this desire line leads to. And again, this is early in the morning during lockdown, but the way that the park can make those spaces for people just to have those kind of private moments of reverie. And there they are again. And in the initial scheme, that sense of kind of interweaving play into it by making these sort of suggestive pieces, which were the carved stone that were playable. And we also installed these large pieces of plane trees, which had these cast cushions inlaid into them. But unfortunately, these were removed when there was the accident with the child in Mile End with the kind of natural clay, so they're no longer there. And then this is a plan just showing the general arrangement with the Shahed Saleem monument. The original one is here. And then this is the sort of the geometry that we made with this sort of promontory coming between these two hills here. So you get this long view from the road across here as a kind of invitation to come to the monument through the landscape. And then it has a little set of stairs here so that when the ceremony's going on, people can stand up here and give speeches, which is what happens on Language Day. And then this is the footprint of the church, making this east-west route, so you can kind of be in the park but still be on your way, and then intersected with the original footprint of the Whitechapel, and then making a setting for the monuments that existed in the park. So everywhere there was an existing monument to put York stone down. So that's the view looking from the east towards the Shahed Saleem, looking through that sort of small valley in the landscape. And as part of the kind of testing of those initial ideas, we undertook a series of action research processes on site, one of which was on the Language Day before the renovation of the park. We commissioned a number of Bangladeshi artists to come and paint alpanas on the ground. And this is something that traditionally happens in Dhaka. As you can see, the weather in Dhaka on the 12th of February is much better than it is in London. But they paint this processional route, and people come to the monument and lay these wreaths on it, which is the same as what happens in London. And so that sense of kind of finding a way to spend time in the park long enough to have conversations with people about kind of what that meant to them was really, really important. And this woman here in her lovely pink coat was walking through the park and just stopped and looked at me and said, "But what's a white woman doing painting Alpana?" And it was kind of the question that I didn't have an answer to, but it was the question kind of I needed to hear to think about what we were doing, and to kind of make sure that there was some kind of accuracy in this design that we were bringing forward. And the other piece of action research we did was, one of the observations was that there were relatively few children use the park and very few young women, and part of that was probably cultural. But we wanted to make a kind of an event where we could bring together all the different park using constituencies. So with the Museum of London, we organised an archaeological dig to reveal, which you can see in this image here, the kind of intersecting pieces of the ruins of the church below the ground. And the process of the excavation obviously kind of revealed all these finds, and we ran a series of workshops where I think it was about kind of 900 school children came through and participated in the dig. And in parallel with the dig, we ran this thing called the artifact exchange. And so in exchange for a cup of tea and a piece of cake, we asked people to give an object that was in their pocket and a reason why it had meaning for them. And they wrote it on these labels here. And then these became exhibited alongside the historic artifacts to sort of really foreground that idea that kind of history is made of many interleaving narratives. There's never a dominant narrative. It just depends who's telling the story, which narrative you hear. And these are the girls from Mulberry School who came and participated in the dig. And so here the children with the artifacts, both donated artifacts and artifacts that had come out of the ground. And this is one of the street drinkers who occupies the park. And so again, it was bringing together those different constituencies and allowing those different stories to be told together. And then these are a series of the artifacts that people left on the table. And so this is somebody who left some of the kind of drugs that they needed to keep them sane, as they said. But I like the way that they've miswritten it, saying, "I have to keep this to keep you sane," and various other very kind of personal stories that people told us. That were then sat alongside these kind of objects that had a much more sort of academic interpretation of what they were. And those pieces that came out the ground were then commemorated in these plinths. So the pieces that obviously were able to kind of survive being exposed to the weather were inset into terrazzo and ground down and polished. And we designed this a kind of display for them, which sort of mimicked again the kind of formal furniture that you would get in a graveyard. And so this is the plinths inlaid with the artifacts, and then along the lectern here there's a series of enamel plates that were designed with Axel Feldman from Objectif that tell the history of the park and tell all those intersecting narratives, and then tell the story of the design process with the archaeological dig and the Alpana. So it kind of brings together the description of how this place came into being. And again, along the street facing edge, along the railing, there was again this narrative that described the all of the dominant features of the park. So the kind of commemoration to Altab Ali, the description of what the Shahed Saleem monument means, and then a description of the history of the churches that stood on the site. And you can see here through the fence, the way that raised walkway does act as a kind of a dispersed social space to accommodate many different people doing many different things. And this is the International Language Day, and the way then the plinth becomes a stage for these people who are listening to speeches that are made where people make the processions. And I think that's the last slide. Yes, that's the last slide. So that's the sort of description of the scheme and the process whereby we made it in summary. And I don't know if anyone's got any questions we can take.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I mean, what I'll do is I'll just sort of ask you a few things that we talked about before about the themes and the processes of making the park. One of the things that we were talking about earlier was about how you were approached by the client. So what the council wanted, and then how you sort of went about reassessing or reappraising the brief that was given to you, and coming up with a sort of a different approach to the park. How did that happen, and what were they looking for? Because you said it was part of the High Street 2012 project.
I can see, I can see Tim Rettler's in the audience, so you might have to unmute him so he can correct me if I tell the story wrong. But the commission was multi-client between Tower Hamlets and I think it was called Design for London then, and TfL I think were part of the client group, and the brief was a very incredibly well-researched piece of work by Fluid that had looked at the entire route from Aldgate up to Stratford and produced this incredibly comprehensive urban analysis, and drawn from that kind of themes to address the kind of greening of the street, the social life of the street, the sort of traffic calming, decluttering and urban design. When we looked at the brief in more detail, I think kind of our response was to approach it from a sort of slightly tangential sense of a much more granular look at the actual place, and also looking at the budget that we had to work with, thinking that probably wasn't going to be able to deliver all the things that were in the brief. Can I just share the screen again and I can show you the why can't, oh, okay, so this is the this is an image from the initial brief, which looked at this route from Aldgate all the way down to the Olympic Park. You know, fantastically ambitious, kind of really amazing vision that drew in all of these different kind of threads along the street. And then we were working in this one tiny little pocket here. And the initial brief that we were given was to, sorry, for some reason my computer went. Okay, so this is a sort of summary of the work they did, which was you know, looking at all these different strands, and then there were these kind of project areas. So this is the one that we were looking at. We also did the Mile End Waste and the Mile End intersection as well. And then this was the extract from the, so this was the concept drawing in the brief, which had many different sort of elements in it, some of which were kind of funded out of our funding streams, some of which weren't. So there was this extensive renovation of the facades of buildings along here. But the initial brief was to look at the streetscape, to change the pavement, to put in catenary lighting, and then to look at Altab Ali Park and opening it up to the street. And they made this, here we go. So this is the kind of brief concept design, so with catenary lighting, and then having this tiered kind of seating, so making more kind of permeability into the park. And I think one of the things that we kind of realised was that because that, well, the wall is a listed monument into the park, and because of the level difference and the fact that this was a graveyard at some point, if you started to take this wall apart, not only would you probably spill bones onto the pavement, but also it would probably be very difficult to do in terms of getting planning permission, given it was listed. And so our sense was to kind of work with what was there, rather than to try and kind of intervene into the actual lightly, was a sort of a conceptual approach that we started with, of how to kind of make these almost sort of surgical incisions into the park that didn't kind of destroy what was there, but kind of like found the value in it and kind of augmented that or magnified that. And so I think that was the difference, in, I suppose, in a way, between the brief that we were given and what we actually did. And I think that potentially is, I don't know, maybe Tim would like to comment, but I think that sense of like the sense of the road as a boulevard and as a route to the Olympics, I think we kind of turned that around a bit, and rather than kind of looking along it as this sort of, you know, transitional boulevard, we were much more interested in thinking about kind of like the sticky edges and what happens if you come off the boulevard into those kind of spaces on the edge, and how can they become much more kind of locally valuable.
So you're mentioning Tim might want to say something. What was Tim's role in that?
Tim was client.
Okay. Does Tim want to come in at all?
Yes, I can. Thank you. It's a great presentation, and it sort of just reminds me of all the long discussions we had on this project. And I guess maybe just to recap from my point of view, I think what was really interesting about the project, that there was quite a few client bodies involved with that. There were 2 local authorities. There was what was then the London Thames Gateway Development Corporation, what was then called English Heritage, Transport for London. So I guess all these organizations came at it from a slightly different angle, and we were very, very nervous about this sort of window dressing approach for, you know, beautifying effectively the marathon route in a very superficial way. And I guess through the work that Fluid then developed along the entire route, it was already sort of sowing the seeds of, rather than having a one-size-fits-all approach, to look at the sort of more granularly, as I guess Katherine sort of alluded to, at the various intrinsic places and what they have to offer. And I guess what I think Altab Ali is really good at is sort of it really tested and stress tested the brief, in the sense that I think sort of it pushed what the high street is. In that case here, it's very much about that adjacent green space in an area of deficiency. And it sort of unearthed lots of history, which obviously the brief couldn't really predict. And I think that's always the case with public realm projects, where you feel like, oh, you've got a really clever brief, but actually the projects really only get really interesting when someone challenges that brief. And I think MUF and their team have been really good at doing that. And I think what's also really interesting about the project is that I was sort of, you know, done under in a time with like political leadership that was then Mayor Boris Johnson and then Mayor Lutfur Rahman, and you know, people talk about their grand project that sort of are driven by the sort of the will of politicians, but I think really great projects often happen despite the will of politicians, and I think that's maybe one really good example here. And maybe the falling away of the marathon route and the pressure that came with that sort of enabled the project really to find its root and its real purpose, and I think that's really great.
So I think one of the for me, one of the really successful things about the park is the way in which it feels like a very local space, and it's always used by people on their sort of just daily activities, and very well used as well, and used by quite a range of people. It's very representative of what is in Whitechapel, and Whitechapel is, you know, multi-layered, highly complex place, which has always been a place of migration and movement of people. That kind of that sort of layering or unpacking of the history of the site, is that something that, from a client point of view, so from your point of view, Katherine, from the design team's point of view, is that something that you expected to do from the beginning, or is that something that started to happen through these sort of action research projects that you talked about, or was it that, you know, you knew that there was a lot to unpack in this location, and it was a question of starting to kind of peel back the layers, because that's a really sort of unique thing about this work, I think.
Well, I think that was an aspiration from the start to kind of, exactly like you say, peel those layers back. And I think the reason that we wanted to do that was because it felt like that was the only way to kind of, like, having those action research activities in the park was the only way to kind of engage with people, because it felt like we had to give something back that was of interest and value to them in order for them to come and be part of the design process. I don't think, you know, showing drawings in a hall was not an appropriate way to try and progress the accuracy of the design. It just felt like we had to be there on site, kind of doing things. You know, Tim was brilliantly supportive, because we, you know, doing the dig was, you know, it was in addition to it was you know, it had to be funded, and we went on and on about it, and then Tim was really supportive in making sure that it happened. And Museum of London were just so good to work with as well, and they made it so inclusive and and it was such a dramatic event to kind of peel back the ground and actually see, you know, the evidence of what we knew was there, and to share that with people who use the park every day.
I think also it seems very prescient now, because there's so many conversations. There's a big issue now around public space and what gets represented and whose histories are being represented in public spaces. And, you know, there's a kind of big upheaval around the concept of public space at the moment, quite rightly. And it seems that you have, you know, you kind of preempted this. You're already looking at these issues and managing to represent histories which both long view histories, which are going right back to the kind of, you know, 13th century Whitechapel, as it were, but also very contemporary histories around the Bangladeshi community, and bringing those together into one space, which I think is the sort of really kind of unique thing. There is, in our chat today in the group, in the audience, we've got a number of people that'd be really good to try and bring in who are connected with work around Whitechapel. Julie Begum is one of them. Also, we've got the team from the Tower Hamlets Local History and Local Archives here, which is fantastic. So I'm going to try and bring them in, Tamsin, Halima, and a new colleague who I don't think I've met, but I'm sure Tamsin will let me know, and Halima will let me know. But I wonder if we can just, Julie, I don't know whether we can have your thoughts on, I don't know if you're able to speak. I don't know whether you could be unmuted. You're in there somewhere.
Hello,
hi Julie, hi.
Hello everyone.
Hello. Of Swadhinata Trust, which is a Bangladeshi cultural heritage organisation. Julie,
it's a British Bengali community organisation.
Yes, correct me. Yeah, you must correct me.
Correct that, because
you should do. Yes.
Just focus on the Bangladeshi aspect, but for me, it's very much rooted in the British experience of being a Bangladeshi or a Bengali. So that's,
Yeah.
I'd like to point that out.
Good. No, please do. And I mean, you do a lot of things. The park is very significant for a lot of aspects of British Bengali culture, isn't it? I don't know whether you want to just sort of talk a little bit about that, about what it means to the community.
Yes, I think Katherine illustrated very well in her brief how well used the park is by lots of different types of people, and in particular some of the Bengali, Bangladeshi people, to mark particular occasions in the cultural and historical calendar. So the Language Day, Altab Ali Day, but also political action relating to anti-fascism and anti-racism in the borough. So there's been numerous demonstrations and protests that have started or finished there. I can think of when the EDL, the English Defence League, wanted to march through Tower Hamlets, lots of anti-fascists and anti-racists met in Altab Ali Park to stand our ground there, and we rallied there. When the Cable Street anniversary, one of the events that takes place every year, the Battle of Cable Street, once the rally started at Altab Ali Park and finished at Cable Street Gardens. So it's always been used by lots of different people locally for different types of action and activities. And it's something that has been done regardless of who's organising it. So nowadays, the council is very sort of like managing some of the events like the Altab Ali Day. But before that, local organisations and community groups would use that park to commemorate Altab Ali's murder long before the council started to take any notice of it, really. So I think it's really important to recognise those contributions and to sort of bring those stories to life like you have done in your in the way that you've dressed the park to tell the stories that have happened in the past, but also look at the way it's been used in contemporary use, really.
And do you think the way that the park's designed sort of as a key enables that, in terms of there isn't necessarily a kind of singular or dominant narrative in the park, but there's numerous narratives that are taking place? They're almost like in dialogue with each other.
It's very busy. It's very, very busy. It's a very small park, and somehow I find there's lots of different voices that are competing to be heard in that space. And it's not by accident that children don't play there or women don't frequent it. It's not because it's a cultural issue. There isn't the space for, it's not particularly family friendly. And because it's so exposed in lots of ways, it's not the safest place for women to come together as well. So in many ways, it's not the best space for lots of people. But I think when we're coming together as a community, it is a very important space because it is trying to bring lots of different people together under one umbrella in a lots of ways. So when the anti-fascist, anti-racist community come together, it's a visible presence of all different types of people who come together in those occasions.
Yeah, that's interesting, the sort of ways in which it works and ways in which it might not work as well. I'm going to ask Tamsin, who is on here as Ruth, to ask you a question, Tamsin. Are you, yeah, go on. And Tamsin is the Heritage Manager for Tower Hamlets, and Tower Hamlets Heritage and Local History Archives are a fantastic organisation. I've done a lot of work with them over many years, and I'm very happy to have Tamsin and the team here. So go for it, Tamsin.
Night off, haven't you?
Yeah.
I saw it this morning, and I was very excited to be able to join.
Yeah.
I started as manager of Tower Hamlets Local History Library and Archives in 2009, and I was commuting on the 25 bus for most of the first sort of 10 years of working here. And so I saw the sort of transformation of Altab Ali Park every day. And I really think of all of the High Street 2012 initiatives, it was the most successful. I really, really, really appreciated what you did design-wise with the space and the public realm improvements that happened. I think that they've endured as well. And it's so much, even though I agree with Julie, it's it's not a perfect park. It's not a nice real place to hang out if you're a woman. There are sort of groups of men who gather a lot, and I think it's kind of hard to design a space for everybody in that way. But I think that the heritage, the Bangladeshi heritage particularly, that was evoked through the design was done really, really well. So I just wanted to say that to start off with. What was my question? Yeah, so I guess I manage the sort of, I guess, the team and the service which provides public access to the documentary heritage of the borough, which includes obviously not just archival documents and books and maps and photographs, but also audiovisual material, oral histories, intangible heritage as well, that we like to call it. But we don't have much of a profile because we're a council department and we don't really have the marketing budget of your big hitter cultural institutions. So nobody, sadly, we're gradually kind of growing our profile. But we do get quite often people approaching us for information about you know, how the works that were done to Altab Ali Park, or, you know, do you know who did it? Do you know what happened? How can we get involved to do something like that in this park instead? And we are sort of a bit of an access point for local community groups who want to explore heritage in the public realm. And indeed, my colleagues Halima and Sanjida, who are also in the audience, feel free to chip in, guys. We are, and Emily, I think, is here from the National Portrait Gallery as well. We're all working together on our first ever public realm project that we were initiated due to the pandemic, an exhibition that we were going to be doing next year in March to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Bangladeshi independence following the 1971 Liberation War. It was going to be an exhibition in our probably in our entrance hall, but because of the pandemic and the size of the extreme inequality in terms of the Bangladeshi community's risk and mortality rates being double any other ethnic groups, it's simply not okay for us to promote, to deliver a project which is indoors. We also make it as sort of COVID secure as possible. So we're doing an external installation display of some kind, which is all kind of new for us because we're used to kind of using our building, which is the Bancroft Library in Mile End, for our interpretation. So I guess I've had a lot of thoughts in the sort of 11 years I've been in post about the connection, or perhaps disconnect, between the funding and the institutions and the companies that work on public realm heritage interpretation projects and improvements, and the funding that goes there. And then, which in this case, this was funded, one of the funders was Tower Hamlets Council. And services like us, which is 100% funded by Tower Hamlets Council, but we weren't involved in any of the processes that you guys did. And I guess one of the things that I want to understand more broadly is how the worlds of collections holding institutions, the worlds of documentary heritage, kind of archives, libraries, museums, and the worlds of public realm architects, planners, can kind of connect and understand each other's priorities and work together in a way that isn't always just transactional, like, I need to buy an image to put in my heritage statement for this planning application, so I'm going to buy an image. You know, how can we actually exploit each other's and learn from each other's skills, which are specialists? You know, we have specialist skill sets in our respective professional disciplines. And I think in my authority in Tower Hamlets, there is too much of a disconnect between public realm and the library service, for example, which is a whole, you know, local authorities issue. But I'm also interested in how it pans out across urban centres, you know, across London. We can't be the only people in this world, in the city with this experience. And so yeah, I'm just interested in your thoughts on that, really.
Wow,
Katherine,
that's such a good question. That's such a brilliant question. I mean, I think that at the time when we were making the design, I think the council was particularly going through, they weren't in a good place because it was post crash, and there was a lot of disconnect going on between the different departments, which was quite hard to find our way to find the people to talk to, because people just seem to have become very siloed and hunkered down. And I think that was just symptomatic of that time, and hopefully, you know, we're in a different time now. But I think exactly like you described, making those relationships across those different kind of knowledge bases is just fundamental to delivering quality work. And I think part of the problem is that the way public realm projects are structured is that they never have enough time for proper research. They never have enough time to really, you know, people talk about engagement, but they don't actually kind of make space to make the time to do the kind of engagement that you're talking about, which is a kind of a speculative research process with other expertise that might really change the brief. Because I think, you know, most public realm projects are kind of outcome oriented. They're already written with a sense of what will be delivered and what the what the kind of outputs and outcomes will be. And I think that's really problematic. So I think it needs to happen at a kind of brief development level. And you know, I think how, when you're funded by the council who are generating briefs, can you be part of that process is the question. And it's very, very difficult. Yeah, I mean, we get to the end of projects and we just think, oh, right, now we know what the brief should have been, and it's and you spent the money, and it's just really difficult.
It might be a good time to do our big reveal now, because Liza might have some thoughts on that as well. So our big reveal is basically, if it works, is Liza in Altab Ali Park doing a kind of walk around.
No, it was just following up Katherine's points that it's been. We're just working now in Brixton, around the Brixton Rec, which is a building which is, you know, has been as contested perhaps as Altab Ali. And because of COVID, we weren't able to meet anyone. So we were able to flip the normal way of doing things, to start with catching the archive just before it closed, and then doing some deep sort of historical research with Rob Bevan and Claire Thread before we spoke to anybody. And I think that claiming that time for what you describe and working with the knowledge of a place is really worth doing. I just thought at this point I'd just turn my camera on, because I'm in Altab Ali. Four women, annoyingly, have just left the plinth. But at that moment when it was commented on that this wasn't a place for women, in fact, it was 60-40 men to women here at the plinth. So it's interesting on a hot day who is here. The ground is almost brown from the sun, but there is space for more than one thing at a time. There's the polished edge of the plinth. There's somewhere to sit. There's the imagined fragments. What are we doing? It's weird walking backwards.
Are there still people sleeping under the trees?
Small groups of people finding somewhere to sit. Fragment of a croon board. There's a second one. Sorry, just going to. Here again is that polished edge.
Is there something in, I mean, a question to all of you really, but do you think there's something in Altab Ali Park, the way it's been done?
Small groups of people.
Do you think there's something in Altab Ali Park, Liza and Katherine, the way that you've designed it, that is a sort of a way in which
and then we're just approaching the monument with this constructed setting of an almost a riverbed.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, can you hear me, Liza? Not sure if she can hear.
I'll text her.
Yeah, because the monument was actually there when you started the work, wasn't it?
Yeah, the monument was there. We just made the setting for it, made a kind of much higher quality plinth for it. It was quite, bizarrely sort of appropriate, it felt, some material at the base of it. What was your question? You were going to say something?
Yeah, I'm saying this.
I'm just going to finish a little bit further, just to complete. There's the trees at the beginning to block out the residents who are anxious to keep this railing between themselves and the park.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And importantly, somewhere you can feel safe to
have a nap,
have a late afternoon snooze.
So I was going to say, I don't know, Liza might carry on talking, but I was saying that is there a way, is the park giving us a sort of template, if you like, of how to deal with public space?
So even at 6-ish, in fact, there are about 14 women in here, some with companions and some alone, but it is looking very worn out. And if everybody here joined us just for a moment of litter picking and decompression of the soil, that would be a nice way to spend the afternoon. Thanks.
Thanks, Liza. I don't think, can you hear me? Not really, but yeah, so I was saying that is there a way in which is there a methodology in the way that you've approached the park which can be sort of used for creation of public spaces in complex, societies like London, in these kind of like highly diverse, sort of super diverse places where there's many layers of culture, of history, of communities. I mean, I think like Tamsin was saying, I think it's a hugely successful place, and I don't live too far away from it, so I'm sort of familiar with it on many occasions. I kind of, it's part of my sort of environment, and I think it works incredibly well. And I don't know of any other place, sort of certainly in kind of inner London, that does that. And do you think there's a way, is there almost like a sort of methodology that's being put forward with this project as to how we ought to be approaching public spaces?
Well, I think the methodology that we used was very much about starting with observational analysis of what was actually happening there, and how, like, what the unmet needs were, and trying to accommodate for them. And so, I think it's a park that has a huge demand made on it, and the kind of the accommodation of that demand wasn't done in a way we felt that was sort of welcoming. I mean, neither in the material nor in the kind of formal organisation of the park itself. So I think that kind of, that was the methodology we bring. And I think that I mean, that's kind of, how one would want any space to be designed, with that methodology of close looking, observational analysis, identification of needs, and ensuring there's a kind of democratic and inclusive accommodation. And, one also has to acknowledge kind of the limits of what design can do as well, because it can't change, within a finite budget. You can't change everything. So you make decisions about where you put value. And I think we made a decision to kind of make high quality materials in order to sort of celebrate that as a kind of social local space.
If I can chip in, I'm in the sort of making sure that the members of the communities who are sort of directly affected or being represented by a public realm project like this, in this case the Bangladeshi community, are included in the process, and the equitableness, is that a word, of their involvement, such as, you know, thinking about things such as where does the funding go, who gets paid, you know, if there is a budget of X, how much of that total budget, irrespective of who does what, how you know, ideally, you know, how much of it is actually going to people from the Bangladeshi community locally, and also how are decisions made, where is the power located when we're dealing with a community, you know, we're talking about a refugee community from from a, well, not refugee, an economic migrant community whose history is one of oppression, a violent oppression, you know, from partition to 1971. How can we, as sort of people in institutions and people who have budget holders and who have writing briefs and are commissioning projects like this, how can we make sure that the structure of and the methodology of our projects is sharing, assuming that we are all majority white, which we are in London, the people in the positions of power, how can we ensure that there is an equitable kind of partnership process with the communities affected? So, with a direct example, I'm sure there'll be lots of African Caribbean community groups who have got a lot of things to say about how that space should be transformed. How does one go about what, you know, the shaping and structuring a brief and a project methodology such that those community groups and individuals get a good shake of the stick and get to
as Katherine said, by putting the work into that early stage of expanding the client, and it requires the client, you know, what's called co-design needs to first be co-clienting. In the case of Altab Ali Park, there was a very significant players in terms of local councillors. And so the moves that were made to make sure that not only the history of the site in terms of 4 Christian churches, but also a memorial that had sat without anything to tell you what it was. I mean, as somebody who lived relatively locally, I'd assumed it was maybe a piece of, you know, until we understood what it was, that maybe it was a piece of art, something to do with the Whitechapel Gallery. And so making that clear decision to put a significant part of the budget into the setting and the embellishment of the monument, the work that was done to ensure that the signage gives equivalent to those 3 histories of the Shahed monument, the history of Altab Ali, the murdered garment worker, and lastly to Whitechapel, so that there is that equivalence. The enamelled signs, for anyone who knows about enamel, actually were made twice because of the impassioned discourse about which dialect and which typography to use for that dialect, in order that the translation, which went backwards and forwards between them, was just right. So I suppose these were small, and as Katherine said, go looking for the Alpana painters so that they were paid as part of that brief development process, were small gestures on our part 10 years ago to ensure that funding, which came to mark and celebrate the Olympics in our brief, you know, there was mention not only, you know, of festoon lighting, but a lot of flags and a lot of painting lampposts in Olympic colours. And we recognised that it was likely there would be no money spent on this place again. And so therefore pushed that funding away from the street into what spaces there were for the community. So I suppose that act of agency and privilege that we have as consultants is what you do with it. In the case of Brixton, we're lucky that there is Black Cultural Archives is there. There's opportunity to fund that expertise, but also build large steering groups of knowledge who both can develop the project with us, but also challenge us as we go. So I think also for me, you know, sort of resonating with things said earlier, is having seen these platforms to two histories holding others. So, for example, the Black Lives Matter process of 2016, the marking of the 80 years since the Cable Street riots, but then more recently, during lockdown, for those who felt uncomfortable in terms of their health being compromised to travel to central London, there was a Black Lives Matter protest on the same day as the protest in Hyde Park. I'd love to find a way that we could, that there tends to be a serial monogamy, both on the part of practitioners and on the part of funders, of always moving on. And I'd like to see, Tim, that we could work together to get a new good growth fund, which is about actual care and repair, because COVID's demonstrated that care is hard infrastructure. And I'd love to think that we could together find some funding to give that care that I have, as I've sat here, seen, seen not just women, but people with ambulant disabled and others. But I think if we were to be here doing some gardening, some of the other generations who we know from Toynbee Hall, where we've also worked recently, the elder group there, I could imagine them here demonstrating their brutal Karun playing, but also gardening. So I'd really like this to mark this recorded presentation. That's okay, Tim. But let's see if we can find some care funding for places like this.
I mean, the whole thing raises a whole series of really interesting and kind of very prescient issues around the politics of creating public space and public realm projects, issues of heritage, issues of representation, and who's being represented, whose histories are being represented, and how people can attach and belong to the sort of public realm and built environment that they live in. We're over time, so we've gone past our 6:30 cutoff time. So I will hand back to Rosie, I think. And from my side, sort of thank you very much, Liza and Katherine. It's been great to finally be able to sit down and have this conversation. And it's been fantastic to have Tamsin, Julie, Halima, Tim, people from the council involved as well. And it's a sort of conversation. Maybe it's nice to be able to have these kind of conversations amongst stakeholders in a different environment, where things can be talked about in a sort of different way, I suppose. And I think that's a great thing that we've been able to do, even for a short time here. And thanks to the audience as well. Thanks for joining in and taking part. And Rosie, do you want to take over?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, it feels like we were just getting to kind of the real crux of the conversation. It was a shame to cut it off, but yeah, if you're ready, then we can wrap up.
I think the only thing I'd like to say is, as you know, what this was such a significant project for the MUF, for the studio, about that idea that for something to be open-ended and ambiguous requires incredible precision. And I think that answers the point about how are people represented, and how is something open-ended enough that anybody can feel comfortable to be in a place, because they find themselves there, and in doing so they find the permission to be there. And when Katherine presented that very first matrix between this relationship between tangible and intangible fabric and heritage, and that having had that intuition, the work afterwards was to both test and challenge it. But I agree, how can that matrix, in that case, 750 people took part in the dig, but also how could something be procured? I mean, it was procured locally also, because it was procured from Building Crafts College, which was, just at the end of the borough. But yeah, that sort of learning about the precision needed for open-endedness, I think, is the incredible power of it as a process and a place.
Julie, did you want to say anything before we finish? I mean, I suppose.
Can I just say something about procurement?
Yeah.
I think that kind of what Tamsin was saying about how can you ensure that kind of funding that's spent on local public space actually kind of can be shared with the people who use that space. And in many projects, we've tried to make space for like local young people to be apprentices on the project, to get work experience, working with agencies that work with, you know, not in education, training or employment. And it just seems like every procurement structure mitigates against that. And it's just very, very hard. And I think there kind of needs to be a kind of fundamental kind of critique of this notion of co-design, which now is appearing in every brief, because I think it could be structured in such a more proactive way to really make room for, you know, these kinds of projects to be used as training vehicles. But again, it's the kind of, it's the focus on the outcome that's already, you know, crystallized in the brief that doesn't let that happen. And it's so frustrating, because it you know, exactly as been described as a critique of the process we went through, you know, you're already not able to do it from the beginning. So yeah, plea to you, Tim, since you're in the position of how can we make that as well?
But is that a critique of the client? Is that critique of the client?
Whereas the critique of the way funding works and projects are structured, and that the, you know, the will is there, but the kind of mechanism and the process just can't match that will. And so I think things become very tokenistic, and kind of what you end up with is kind of, you know, design process where the, you know, the designer like us remains, you know, holds the power, because it's impossible to give it away.
But I think it's also to do with risk. And so, you know, we know collectively that the real risk is that that funding isn't shared in the place where things are made. But it just means that, you know, in this particular project, my role was part of the sort of coordination, and the sheer agony to get the commissions, which were called artist commissions, but in fact all they were was commissioning craftsmen from up the road. And the agony of £40,000 to ensure that 700 young people of Tower Hamlets would be part of the digging up their own history. Tim will attest that many days of our lives were spent in meetings arguing for something so bleeding obviously of value. So that is... but it is something that in Good Growth by Design, which is the latest of you know, public realm funding, social value and demonstrating social value, reuse of existing materials, etc., is inscribed and is something that they can audit. So maybe it's a little bit better now, but these are tiny projects compared to the multi-million-pound mega developments.
So do you think, I was going to say, so do you think, I mean, you're talking about this project that you were working on 10 years ago, if not slightly more. I mean, is there a difference that you're seeing now, for example, with the Brixton Wreck project?
No, we have to use Altab Ali as an argument to demonstrate that it's possible and that it's valuable. So in the case of Brixton Wreck, the campaigning meant that it was listed rather than being demolished. And the contract assumes that we would stop after stage 3, which is just planning drawings, rather than seeing it through. So it's these projects such as Altab Ali where the battles are played out that we have to return to them to have the same conversation from scratch. But we're lucky, because like Blue Peter, we do have one we made earlier. And that is why perhaps MUF should continue to take our vitamins collectively, because it is a body of experience. Hey, 2 real human children. Can you see them? Can everyone see them?
Yep.
Yeah,
and they're
they
playing.
are.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, they're doing so well. That was so worth the £5 I just gave them. No, actually, those are real children, really skipping and jumping on those fragments of stone.
Yeah, my kids have jumped around on those stone fragments as well, actually, I have to say. So yeah, so they do come in handy.
In response to your question where you said, has it got any easier? I think the way it's not got easier, it's got worse, because I think what's happened is that briefs ask for the kind of engagement that we did on Altab Ali, but they still don't make space to really allow that kind of co-decision making to happen. So that in a way it just feels like it's, yeah, at that point of writing a brief, there needs to be so much more kind of open-ended speculation built into the programme. But you know, but that
yeah, and returning to the archives, because we got an extra 4 months in the sense before we were able to speak to humans, it meant that the officers truly enjoyed the opportunity to read those big histories, the case of Robs going back to the 19th century, and the chance to have the close looking and observation that Katherine talked about. So actually in the case of Brixton, where we're able now, it also was a way that we were able to get trust ourselves, because we were able to share our reading of what was going on there and our description of where our gaps were. And that has built a level of trust that previously apparently hasn't happened in borough funded projects. So and we're lucky that we have 2 Tim Rettlers as our client there, 3. So yeah, it's all good.
Yeah, it does feel like we're just getting going really with the conversation, but
yeah, let's stop.
I know that we're over time.
I have to say, Marius of Drawing Matter had an hour slot, and 2 hours 40 minutes later, I had to say, I really have to go and cook now. Bye.
Yeah, I'm sure people everybody get outside for the kind of warm evening or thunderstorm.
So I think you're doing well.
Yeah, but the whole issue of co-production and participation and the kind of the involvement and the engagement, it's not just engagement, but as you say, co-production of public space or of the built environment is a topic that we haven't worked out how to properly do. I mean, I think you're probably showing a way of doing that, but I think as wider practice, it's still something that needs a lot of work, and maybe one of the topics that you guys, Ellis and Rosie,
I
can
think
explore.
that was a really good topic for another session.
Yeah,
with,
I think so.
With other practitioners.
Yeah.
And you can unpick the mysterious term co-design and co-production.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that co-production has started to take over from participation. So it used to be participation was the way in which engagement was described, and now there's this other sort of ways of talking about it. But whether there's genuine design is always the issue, I think, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and I think there's very little kind of post-project review to actually kind of measure how successful that process was, and to actually quantify where value lies.
Yeah, I mean, the architectural press is probably a big culprit of that as well, because they only ever sort of focus on the thing at the point of completion, but never really what's actually happened to it, a year down the line. But that's a whole other topic as well.
Friday night drink.
I know. Are you giving a tour? I am. Yeah. What is your tour? Will you tell me?
Jack the Ripper.
Jack the Ripper tour.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Quite dark and macabre.
Oh no, I'm not here for the tour.
Murder.
As Katherine said, it's a place of more than one thing at a time.